The night the prairie winds howled low and the lantern light trembled against the walls. She stood at the doorway of the cabin that was no longer hers. The boards beneath her feet groaned as if they, too, disapproved of her presence. In her arms were 3 swaddled bundles, tiny breaths fogging the cool air, little fists curling and unclenching with the innocence of newborn life. Triplets, all girls. Instead of being met with joy, the news had carried shame, suspicion, and whispers sharp as knives. In the world she had been born into, a woman's worth was measured by silence, obedience, and the ability to bear sons. She had failed in the eyes of her kin, though she had done nothing but bring life into the world. And so the verdict was swift. She was to leave, cast out with nothing but her children and the clothes on her back. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, a sound like a gavel striking. She tried to beg, tried to reason, but the faces she had once trusted turned away. The fire inside the home she had known burned warm for them, but out here the cold bit deep into her bones. The trail stretched endless before her, each step away from that threshold carrying the weight of betrayal. She had no horse, no wagon, not even a loaf of bread tucked into her satchel, only the 3 tiny souls she clutched to her chest. And as she stumbled into the night, she knew survival would be a merciless battle. The plains were cruel to those who walked them unprepared. Coyotes cried in the distance, a chorus that made her heart jolt with fear. The babies stirred at the sound, one giving a small whimper, then another, until the silence of the land was broken by the fragile voices of 3 hungry little girls. She hushed them, swaying though her arms ached, whispering promises she was not sure she could keep. The moon above cast a silver glow on her path, guiding her like an unblinking eye. Watching to see if she would endure or falter. By morning, her shoes were muddied and torn. Dust clung to her hem, and her hair hung loose, tangled by the wind. She had wandered for miles, though she had no destination, no refuge waiting for her. Villages and homesteads in these parts were not kind to women alone, and even less so to those burdened with children. To them, she would be a beggar, an outcast, a warning. But still she pressed forward, her every step driven by the instinct to protect the daughters in her arms. Each one so small, yet each one carrying the weight of a future that might never be allowed to unfold. The second night was colder than the first. Her lips cracked, her voice raw from murmuring lullabies to soothe the cries of her hungry little ones. She had no milk to offer, no fire to warm them, only her body pressed close to theirs. Every rustle in the grass, every snapping branch made her stiffen. The wilderness did not pity the weak. Yet even as exhaustion claimed her, she forced herself to keep moving, fearing that if she stopped, the darkness would swallow them whole. It was on the 3rd dawn, when her strength was nearly gone, that she stumbled into the shadow of the ranch. The land stretched wide, a fence line running against the horizon, the faint smoke of a chimney rising in the distance. The sight of it nearly buckled her knees, but desperation carried her forward. Her feet dragged across the dirt yard, and when she finally reached the porch, she thought she might collapse right there. The door loomed before her, weathered and silent, and she raised a trembling hand to knock. Inside, the man who owned that ranch had risen with the sun, as he always did. He was not a man of many words. Silence was his truest companion. Folks in town spoke of him with both respect and distance, saying he was a man marked by solitude. His days were carved by hard work, his nights by the quiet crackle of a fire. He carried the look of someone who had lost more than he had ever spoken aloud, and so he let the land be his confessor. Few dared approach him, and fewer still claimed to know his heart. When he opened the door, his eyes fell upon the sight of a woman swaying on her feet, clutching 3 infants against her chest. Her face was pale, her lips blue from the cold, yet her gaze was fierce, a fire burning behind the exhaustion. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. For a long moment, the man said nothing, his silence stretching heavy between them. The wind swept across the yard, rattling the porch boards, as though urging him to make his choice. The woman thought he might turn her away. She had known rejection too many times in too few days, and she braced herself for it again. Her arms tightened around her daughters, shielding them from the blow she was certain would come. But instead, something shifted in his gaze. He stepped forward, his shadow falling across her like shelter. He looked at the tiny faces peeking from the blankets, their breaths shallow but steady, and then back at the woman who refused to surrender despite her frailty. Without a word, he extended his hand out. It was not just an offer of help, but a promise. A silent vow spoken through action alone. She stared at that hand, her mind reeling. Could she trust it? Could she trust him? She had been cast aside, deemed unworthy, burdened by life she had created. Yet here was a man, known for his silence, offering her something she had thought lost forever. A chance that her fingers hovered above his, trembling with doubt and hope alike. Behind her, the open plain stretched wide and merciless. Before her, the doorway promised warmth, food, perhaps even safety. Still, she hesitated, for nothing in her life had ever been given without a price. She searched his face for a sign, for a reason, for a truth that might assure her this was not another trap. The babies stirred again, their tiny cries filling the air, pressing her to decide. Her heart pounded as she inched closer, ready to place her fate and theirs into the calloused hand of a man she did not know. The moment stretched, the choice hanging in the balance, as though the land itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. And then, just as her fingertips brushed his palm, the sound of hooves thundered from the distance. Dust rose. On the horizon, riders approaching fast, their silhouettes cutting through the morning light. The man's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking past her to the trail beyond. The peace of that porch was broken, the air thick with an unspoken warning. She turned to see them coming, her body instinctively shielding her children once more. Questions burned in her throat, but fear swallowed them. Who were they? What did they want? And would this rancher, this silent stranger, truly stand beside her when they arrived? The wind carried the rumble closer, and with every beat of the hooves, her heart thudded louder. She was caught between the past that had cast her out and the uncertain hand that had reached for her. The choice she made now would shape not only her fate, but the future of the three little girls who depended on her. And as the riders closed in, the silent rancher finally opened his mouth to speak. The riders came fast, their silhouettes sharpening with every beat of hooves against the hard ground. Dust trailed them like a storm cloud, swallowing the horizon in its wake. The woman's breath caught in her chest as she clutched her daughters tighter. Her heart hammered, every instinct screaming that danger was drawing near. She turned her gaze back to the rancher, searching his face for some clue, but his expression was as unreadable as the endless sky above. His hand, though, never faltered, still offered forward, steady and sure. The sound grew louder, closer, filling the air with a thunder that shook the boards beneath her feet. She braced herself, torn between fleeing and standing frozen on that porch. But where would she go? Behind her stretched only the barren plains, offering no cover, no safety. In front of her stood the man who had yet to speak, whose silence was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. She felt her fingertips trembling against his rough palm as if the entire world had narrowed to this moment. The riders broke through the curtain of dust at last. There were three of them, dark shapes against the light of morning. Their hats were pulled low, coats snapping in the wind, spurs glinting when they reined their horses to a halt. The lead rider dismounted with a sharp motion, boots sinking into the dirt, and the other two followed. They moved with purpose, as men accustomed to being obeyed without question. The woman's breath turned shallow as their eyes landed on her, and the small bundles pressed close to her chest. The rancher finally shifted. He stepped off the porch, placing his body slightly in front of hers, his stance unyielding, though he still said nothing. The lead writer smirked, but it was not a kind smile. It carried the weight of something unspoken, something dangerous. His gaze slid from the rancher to the woman, then down to the infants. The silence stretched thick, broken only by the restless snort of the horses. "You found yourself some trouble," the writer said at last, his voice coarse and low. The rancher didn't answer. He simply stood there, shoulders squared, jaw set like iron. The woman swallowed hard. She wanted to ask who they were, what they wanted, but her voice wouldn't rise above the pounding in her chest. The babies stirred at the tension, their tiny whimpers breaking the quiet. The sound seemed to hang in the air, innocent yet sharp enough to cut through the weight pressing down on the porch. The lead writer tipped his hat back, revealing a scar that ran along his jaw. "You know what happens when someone takes in what don't belong," he said slowly. His eyes, cold and narrowed, shifted back to her as though she were nothing more. Then a burden left out in the wild dot. The rancher didn't flinch. His silence was not weakness but a wall, firm and immovable. The woman felt her breath steady for just a moment behind him, as though his very presence created a barrier between her and the men before them. Still, fear coiled tight in her stomach. She had been thrown out once already, cast aside by those who should have loved her. Would this be the same? Would the rancher hand her over to these men simply to be rid of the weight she carried? Instead, he did something that caught even her by surprise. He shifted just enough to glance back at her, his eyes steady, calm in the storm. Without words, his look told her one thing: hold on. And for the first time since she had been cast into the cold night with her children, she felt a spark of something she thought long gone: hope. The men lingered, their voices low as they exchanged words she could not hear. Then, with a grunt, the leader tugged at his reins, mounting his horse again. "This ain't the end of it," he said, his gaze fixed on the rancher. "You know the rules." They wheeled their horses and rode off, dust rising once more until the horizon swallowed them whole. The thunder of hooves faded, leaving behind only the whisper of wind against the grass. The woman's knees nearly buckled with relief, though. Unease still clung to her. Whatever threat those men had carried, it was not gone. It only waited. The rancher turned back to her then. For the first time, his voice broke the silence, deep and steady, a sound that seemed to settle into the bones. "You're safe here, for now." His words were few, but they struck with weight. She could only nod, unable to find her own voice. He gestured toward the doorway, and she followed him inside, clutching her children as though letting go would mean losing them forever. The cabin was simple but strong, built of heavy logs, with a hearth glowing faintly in the corner. The smell of wood smoke and leather filled the air. A sturdy table sat near the window, and tools lined the walls with precision. It was a place shaped by solitude and work, not luxury. Yet to her, after nights of cold and fear, it felt like shelter. He motioned toward a chair, and she lowered herself into it, her body aching with exhaustion. The babies stirred again, their small cries reminding her of their hunger. The rancher disappeared into another room and returned with a tin cup of water and a cloth bundle of food. He placed them gently on the table without a word. His silence was not unkind, it felt deliberate, as though he knew words were fragile things that could not carry the weight of what was happening. As she fed her daughters as best she could, her mind raced. Who were those riders? Why had they spoken of rules, of what did or didn't belong? And why had the rancher, a man who owed her nothing, stepped between her and them? She wanted to ask, yet something in his presence kept her quiet. He would speak when he chose and not before. When the babies finally slept, she looked up to find him watching her, not with suspicion, but with a stillness that carried questions of its own. "Why?" she whispered at last, her voice trembling. "Why would you help me?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the fire, the flames casting shadows across his face. When he finally spoke, his words were slow, deliberate, because no one else would. The truth of it sank into her chest. She had been turned away by blood, by neighbors, by strangers. To hear it so plainly laid bare both the cruelty of the world and the quiet strength of the man before her. Yet it didn't erase the fear still curling inside her. The riders would return. She knew it, and from the way the rancher's jaw tightened, so did he. The hours stretched on, filled with the crackle of the fire and the soft breaths of her sleeping children. Outside, the land lay still, but she felt the weight of eyes that were not there. The ranch was not beyond reach. And whoever those men were, they had made it clear she was marked out as the day faded into night. The rancher moved with the ease of routine, tending to chores, checking the doors, sharpening a blade by the fire. He said little, but every action seemed to carry a message preparation. She sat quietly, her arms wrapped around her daughters, wondering what storm she had brought to his door and whether either of them would withstand it. Her thoughts wandered back to the life she had lost. The faces of her kin, cold and unforgiving, rose in her memory. She had been cast out not because she had sinned, but because she had given birth to 3 girls instead of sons. The injustice burned, but she had no power to change it. All she could do was fight for her daughters, to give them a chance at a life beyond the shadow of shame. And now, here in this rancher's home, that fight had only begun. The riders were not finished. She could feel it in her bones, as sure as the wind sweeping over the plains. They would come back, and when they did, she would learn whether the silent man who had taken her hand truly meant the promise in his eyes. But as the night deepened, a sound cut through the quiet once more, the distant echo of hooves, faint but unmistakable. She froze, every muscle tense, her breath caught in her throat. The rancher set his knife down slowly, his eyes lifting to meet hers. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. They were coming back. The sound of hooves rolled over the land like distant thunder. At first faint, it grew louder, closer, as though the very earth trembled beneath the weight of what was coming. The woman's breath caught, her arms tightening around her daughters. The rancher moved without panic, yet every motion was sharp with purpose. He doused the fire until only a faint glow remained, and the room fell into shadow. He glanced toward her, his eyes steady, telling her without words to stay silent. She pressed her back against the wall, rocking the children gently to keep them quiet, praying their small whimpers would not carry beyond the walls. Her heart raced so loudly she feared the riders could hear it. The rancher slipped a rifle from the wall, the metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. He checked it with practiced hands, then moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to give her a look that warned her to remain hidden. The hooves slowed, then stopped outside. She could hear the creak of saddles, the jingle of spurs, and then voices low, sharp, carrying through the thin night air. She strained to catch the words, but they came in fragments. Her name was not spoken, but she felt it, like a shadow lurking between syllables. One of the men laughed, the sound harsh, before a fist pounded against the door. The rancher did not answer. Silence filled the cabin, thick and heavy, until the pounding came again. Then a voice rang out. "We know she's here. You can't hide what don't belong." Her breath seized. How had they known? Had someone followed her? Or had the land itself betrayed her? She held her babies closer, pressing her lips to their heads to keep from crying out. The rancher remained still, his rifle in hand, his stance calm but unyielding. The men outside waited, muttering, their boots shifting in the dirt. Finally, the pounding stopped. Hooves shuffled, reins snapped, and the voices grew faint again. She dared to hope they had gone, but the rancher's expression did not soften. He knew as well as she did that this was not an end. It was a warning. That night, sleep did not come. She sat near the hearth, her daughters tucked against her, watching the rancher as he worked by lamplight, checking tools, setting locks, his movements deliberate and methodical. She wanted to ask who those men were, why they claimed she did not belong, but her voice stayed caught in her throat. The silence between them grew heavy, filled only by the crack of wood and the restless sigh of the wind outside. By morning, the land seemed too quiet. The rancher saddled his horse, pausing long enough to set a bucket of water near her and a loaf of bread on the table. "Stay inside," he said simply, the weight of his voice brooking no argument. Then he rode off, vanishing into the horizon. She stood at the doorway long after he disappeared, clutching the frame with trembling hands. The vastness of the plains pressed in on her, making her feel smaller than she already did. Alone, she listened to the cries of her children and wondered what dangers he had gone to face. The hours dragged. Every sound beyond the cabin made her stiffen. The cry of a hawk overhead, the rustle of grass outside the window, each one sent her heart racing. She busied herself with tending the babies, rocking them, humming softly to keep her fear from spilling into them. Yet her mind wandered back to the riders, to their sharp words about rules and belonging. There was something larger at play, something she did not yet understand, and it terrified her more than the loneliness of the wild. When the rancher finally returned, dusk painted the sky with streaks of orange and red. His face was shadowed, his clothes dusted from the trail. He set his horse in the corral, his movements steady, but when he entered the cabin, his eyes carried a storm. He said nothing of where he had gone, but the rifle slung across his shoulder spoke enough. He had been watching, guarding, preparing. She longed to ask again, to demand answers, but the words caught in her chest. Instead, she only whispered, "They'll come back, won't they?" His silence was answer enough. Still, yet his ears were always alert, his gaze often drifting toward the horizon as though expecting shadows to emerge. She helped where she could, though her strength was small and her burden constant. She washed clothes, gathered wood, and kept the children warm. In the quiet moments, she thought of the life she had lost, of the cruel faces that had turned her away, then wondered if she had stepped from one cage into another, but slowly, threads began to weave between her and the silent man. He never spoke of his past, yet his every gesture revealed pieces of him. The way he lingered near the babies' cradles, watching them breathe with a softness he tried to hide. The way he left small comforts by her side without a word, a shawl on a cold morning, a cup of warm broth when she was too tired to stand. He was a man carved by loss. She could see that now, though she did not yet know the shape of it. One evening, as the fire burned low, she finally dared to ask, "Why do they say I don't belong? What rules do they mean?" He stared into the flames, his jaw tight. For a long while, she thought he would not answer. Then, in a voice low and heavy, he said, "This land is claimed by men who think it's theirs to govern. They decide who stays, who goes, who lives under their watch. A woman alone, with children and no man to claim her, they see it as weakness. And weakness to them is something to exploit." Her stomach turned. She had thought her exile had been cruel enough, but now she saw her danger stretched wider than she imagined. "And you? Why do you stand against them?" He looked at her. Then, his eyes shadowed yet steady. "Because someone should." The words struck deep, simple yet unshakable. She had been cast aside by many, but here was one man who chose to stand, not for gain, but because it was right. Yet she knew it would cost him. Already the riders had marked him, had warned him. The storm gathering on the horizon was not only hers anymore. As days turned to weeks, whispers of danger grew. Smoke was spotted on the far ridge. Footprints near the creek told of men passing in the night. The cattle grew restless, spooked by unseen threats. The rancher said little, but his vigilance sharpened. He trained her quietly, showing her how to bar the door, how to use a knife if pressed. She resisted at first, trembling at the thought of violence, but his calm insistence left no room for denial. "You have to be ready," he told her, "for them and for the girls." At night, when the babies cried, she rocked them in her arms, whispering promises she prayed she could keep. She dreamed of a future where they might grow without fear, where laughter might replace silence. But each dawn brought only the weight of what still stalked the plains. The rancher grew more distant with each passing day, his eyes scanning the horizon as though chasing ghosts. Sometimes she caught him staring at the children, his expression unreadable, a shadow crossing his face before he turned away. She wondered what memory haunted him, what loss had carved his silence so deep. Perhaps, she thought, that was why he had taken her hand that day. Not because she was worthy, but because he knew too well the weight of being cast out. But the riders did not forget. One morning, smoke rose again in the distance, thicker this time. By nightfall, word reached them, though she did not know how, that a neighbor's barn had burned, cattle stolen, a warning left behind. The message was clear. The men who claimed authority over the land were tightening their grip, and anyone who stood against them would pay the price. The rancher said little, only sharpened his blade again and checked his rifle twice. She felt the tension coil tighter with each day, pressing down on them until even the wind through the grass seemed heavy with threat. And in the quiet, with her children sleeping against her, she wondered if she had doomed not only herself, but the man who had chosen to shield her. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, she stepped onto the porch. The land stretched before her, wide and endless, yet it no longer felt open. It felt caged, the bars invisible but unyielding. She whispered a prayer into the wind, though she did not know who might hear. Behind her, the rancher stepped out, his presence steady beside her. He said nothing, but the silence between them carried more than words could. Together they watched the horizon, where shadows gathered like a storm preparing to break. The hooves would come again. She could feel it, as surely as the earth itself could remember. And when they did, the world she had clung to, fragile as it was, would be tested in fire. The days grew shorter, shadows stretching long across the plains as if the land itself sensed what was coming. The woman moved through each hour with her, heart tight in her chest, every sound outside the cabin setting her nerves on edge. Even the cry of a hawk overhead felt like an omen. The rancher remained steady, his silence unshaken, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes lingered longer on the horizon, the way his hand never strayed far from his rifle. The babies were growing, their cries stronger, their eyes brighter. She rocked them at night, humming softly, though her voice often quivered with fear. She wanted to believe they could have a future here, under this roof, on this land, but with each passing day the threat drew closer. The riders were not men who forgot. She could feel it like a storm crawling on the wind, heavy with thunder, waiting to break. One morning, while the sun was just lifting, the rancher found tracks near the creek. The prints were fresh, too many to be chance travelers. When he returned, his face was carved with grim certainty. "They've been watching," he said, his voice low and final. She shivered, clutching her daughters tighter. The walls of the cabin suddenly felt thin, the door too fragile to stand against what might come. The rancher began his preparations in earnest. He reinforced the windows with thick planks, laid extra logs near the hearth for quick fires, and stored water barrels. Inside, He checked the rifle again and again, the metallic click echoing through the small cabin until it became the rhythm of her dread. She helped where she could, her hands shaking as she carried wood, her breath quick as she gathered supplies. He didn't tell her everything, but she could see it in his eyes. The riders would come not as shadows this time, but as a storm at full strength. In the evenings, he taught her more. How to hold a rifle steady, how to aim if she was forced, how to stay calm when fear threatened to break her. Her arms trembled, her aim poor, but he was patient, his voice steady as he guided her. "Not for you," he told her once, nodding. At the babies bundled on the porch beside them, "For them." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had been cast out, abandoned for birthing 3 daughters, but she would not let them be taken or harmed. The fire inside her grew sharper each time she thought of those riders, of their cold eyes and cruel smirks. She would fight if she had to, though she knew she was no match for men like them. As the days passed, small signs appeared like cracks in the earth before an earthquake. Smoke on the hills. A shot fired in the distance with no target but meant as a warning, a cow gone missing from the herd. The rancher said little, but his movements grew sharper, quicker. At night he stayed awake long after she had tried to rest, his figure outlined by the glow of the fire as he sat sharpening his blade. Listening to the silence beyond the door, the tension grew unbearable. She found herself pacing at night, unable to close her eyes, listening for the sound of hooves that had haunted her dreams since the first knock on the cabin door. She thought often of the home she had been cast from, the people who had thrown her out. She wondered if they knew the danger that had followed her, if they cared at all. Perhaps they were safer for turning her away, but she refused to let that thought weaken her. She had been broken before, and she would not break again. One night, the wind carried voices. She froze, pressing her daughters to her chest, straining to hear. The rancher moved to the window, his body still, his hand gripping the rifle. In the distance, faint but undeniable, men's laughter cut across the plains. It was not close, but it was a message. They were circling, waiting, playing their game until the time came to strike. The rancher barred the door tighter, his jaw clenched. "It'll be soon," he said, his voice rough, almost a growl. She felt her stomach twist. Soon. The word echoed in her head, heavy as a tolling bell. The next day, she found herself lingering near the porch, staring at the horizon as though she could see what lay hidden there. Her babies squirmed in her arms, their small faces turned toward her, innocent and unaware of the shadow that loomed. She kissed their foreheads, whispering promises she was desperate to keep. "I'll protect you," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I'll fight for you, no matter what." The rancher came beside her then, his shadow falling across the dirt. He didn't speak, but when she looked at him, she saw the truth in his eyes. He was preparing to risk everything, not just for the land he worked, but for her and the 3 tiny lives she carried. The weight of it pressed on her chest, heavy and humbling. That evening, as the sun sank and painted the sky in fire, the first true sign came. Dust rose on the horizon, not the drifting kind carried by the wind, but the hard, certain kind kicked up by hooves. The sight froze her where she stood. The rancher followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. He didn't need to say it. They were coming. He moved quickly, gathering supplies, loading weapons, securing the doors. His movements were efficient, rehearsed, as though he had always known this day would come. She hurried to cradle her daughters, placing them in the safest corner she could find, though she knew no corner was truly safe. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The dust cloud grew closer, larger, until she could make out the dark forms of riders against the fading light. They came not as 3 this time, but more. Their numbers impossible to count from the distance, but enough to choke the air with dread. The sound of hooves grew like thunder, steady and relentless. The babies began to cry, their wails filling the cabin, sharp and piercing. She tried to hush them, her hands shaking, but fear made her voice tremble. The rancher turned, his eyes meeting hers. "Stay behind me," he said firmly, his voice like stone. She nodded, though her knees felt weak. The riders drew closer, their shadows stretching long as the sun dipped behind them. She could see the gleam of metal, the flash of spurs, the set of hats pulled low. They came with purpose, with intent, with the weight of authority they believed theirs. The rancher stepped outside, rifle in hand, his frame a dark silhouette against the burning sky. She stood just inside the doorway, her children clutched tight, watching with her breath caught. The riders fanned out, surrounding the yard, their horses stamping and snorting, their eyes fixed on the lone man standing against them. The leader dismounted, the scar along his jaw glinting in the fading light. His smirk was cold, confident. "You were warned," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Now you'll pay the price for keeping what isn't yours." The rancher didn't answer. His silence was heavier than words, his stance unyielding. He lifted his rifle slowly, deliberately, the message clear. The air grew thick, the tension so sharp it made her skin prickle. She held her daughters tighter, whispering prayers, her voice barely audible. The men shifted on their horses, hands drifting to their weapons, the weight of violence hovering like a storm ready to break. The scarred man laughed once, low and cruel. "You can't stand against us, not alone." The rancher's voice cut through the air then, deep and steady, each word deliberate. "I'm not alone." The leader's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, his eyes narrowing. Behind the woman's fear, something sparked in her chest, a flicker of defiance she had thought lost forever. She was no fighter, no warrior. But in that moment she understood this battle was hers as much as his. The riders edged closer, the sound of leather creaking, of spurs striking, of hooves shifting against the dirt. The sky deepened to darkness, the first stars flickering faintly overhead. The ranch, once quiet and still, now stood on the edge of violence. Inside the cabin, the babies wailed louder, their cries echoing like a call. The woman pressed her back to the wall, torn between terror and resolve, her body trembling as the men closed in. The rancher's rifle remained steady, his figure strong against the gathering storm. The leader raised his hand, signaling his men. Hooves shifted, weapons gleamed, the air seemed to hold its breath. And then, in the heavy silence before the first strike, the world felt suspended. As though everything balanced on the edge of a single heartbeat, the air cracked with silence, so sharp it pressed against the woman's chest. The scarred man held his hand aloft, his riders tense, every horse snorting as though they too felt the weight of the moment. The rancher stood unyielding, rifle steady, his voice still echoing. In her ears, "I'm not alone." She pressed her daughters tighter to her chest, their cries muffled against her shoulder, her own fear wrapped in a fragile layer of resolve. For what felt like an eternity, the yard stood still, caught in a balance that could tip either way. Then, in the dim light, something shifted. The scarred man lowered his hand slightly, his eyes narrowing, studying the rancher with a gaze that burned cold. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low, meant more as a threat than truth. The rancher's reply came firm and even. "The mistake was thinking you owned what you never earned." His words cut through the night like a blade. Steady, certain. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, muttering under his breath, and the scarred man's jaw tightened. But then, instead of signaling an attack, he gave a short, sharp whistle. His men hesitated, confused, then turned their rear horses reluctantly. The scarred man mounted again, glaring down at the rancher with hatred that promised this was not finished. "We'll be back," he spat, his voice carrying across the dirt. "And when we do, you'll wish you'd never stood in our way." The rancher didn't move until the last echo of hooves faded into the distance. Only then did he lower his rifle, his shoulders still rigid, his face carved in stone. The woman sagged against the wall, her knees weak, relief crashing into her like a wave. The danger had not ended, but for tonight, the storm had passed. When he finally stepped back inside, she looked at him with questions trembling on her lips, but he shook his head once. "Rest," he said, his voice softer now, though still weighted. "With resolve. You'll need your strength." She tried, but sleep came only in fragments. Her dreams were filled with the sound of hooves, the cold smirk of the scarred man, the endless horizon that seemed always ready to swallow her whole. Yet when she woke to the morning sun, the world felt different somehow. The threat still loomed, but a new thread had been woven through her feared determination. The rancher worked through the day as always, but there was something heavier in his movements. She watched him mend fences, tend cattle, prepare supplies. He said little, yet his silence carried meaning. He knew, as she did, that the riders would return, but neither spoke of it aloud. To give it voice would be to give it more power. As days passed without their return, life on the ranch slowly began to breathe again. The babies grew stronger, their cries sharper, their small hands reaching for the world around them. The woman found herself laughing softly when they smiled, the sound startling her at first, as though she had forgotten laughter could live in her throat. She began to see the cabin not just as shelter, but as something more, home. Fragile though it was, the rancher remained her anchor. He was still the silent man she had first met, but she had learned to read the language of his silence. The way he placed firewood by the hearth without asking if she needed it. The way his gaze softened when the babies slept. The way he lingered near the porch at dusk, keeping watch though he never said so. He carried his burdens quietly, but she could feel their weight. One evening, as the sky bled into twilight, she found the courage to speak. "You didn't have to protect me," she said, her voice low, carrying more gratitude than question. "You could have turned me away like everyone else." He paused, his gaze on the horizon, then turned toward her. "I know what it is to be cast aside," he said simply. The words carried a depth she could not yet reach, but she understood enough. His silence was not emptiness, it was the shield of a man who had lost before, who had chosen to guard instead of surrender. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with something gentler, something that felt like hope. Weeks turned into months, and though the riders never returned, their shadow lingered. The rancher stayed vigilant, and so did she. But as time stretched on, the fear dulled at the edges, replaced by the rhythms of life. The children grew, learning to crawl across the cabin floor, their laughter echoing through the logs. She planted small herbs by the window, filling the air with the scent of life. For the first time since being cast out, she began to feel the stirrings of belonging. The scarred man's promise hung in the air like a storm cloud, but it never broke. Whether by choice or by fate, the riders never came back. Perhaps the rancher's defiance had marked him as too costly to fight. Perhaps the land itself had carried her burden far enough away. Whatever the reason, their absence became its own. Answer. One night, as she rocked her daughters to sleep, she found herself whispering softly into the quiet. "We are safe now," she told them, though part of her new safety was never certain. But in their small breaths, in their tiny hands, clinging to her, she found a kind of truth that went deeper than certainty. She had been thrown out, abandoned, marked as unworthy. Yet here she was still standing, still fighting, still holding on. The rancher came in from the porch then, his boots soft against the floor. He glanced at the babies, then at her. His face, usually so still, carried the faintest trace of something more, a flicker of peace, of acceptance. He didn't speak, but she didn't need him to. She looked around the cabin, at the hearth, at the wooden table worn smooth, at the windows lined with planks that had once been defenses, but now felt like arms holding them in. This place, rough and simple, had become more than walls. It was a refuge, a chance, a promised dot in the quiet. She thought of the people who had cast her out, who had said her daughters were a burden, who had claimed she was unfit to belong. And she thought of the man who had taken her hand when she had nothing left. She realized then that belonging was not given, it was built, chosen, fought for. And in that choice she found her strength. The rancher sat across from her, the firelight flickering between them. The silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. It was steady, comfortable, a silence that spoke of endurance and unspoken bonds. When dawn came, painting the land in gold, she stepped outside with her daughters in her arms. The air was crisp, the horizon wide, the grass bending gently in the wind. She breathed deep, letting the weight of fear slip from her shoulders. The riders might come again one day, or they might not. The future was uncertain. But here, now, they had carved something the world had tried to deny them: home. She turned back toward the cabin, where the rancher stood in the doorway, his figure steady against the light. For a moment, their eyes met, and though no words were spoken, she felt the truth settle deep in her chest. She was not alone anymore. The story of her exile, of her fear, of the storm that had followed her, was not the end. It was the beginning of something greater. She had been thrown out, but in that loss she had found a strength she had never known. And in the silent rancher's hand she had found not only protection but partnership, a chance to rise again. The land stretched endless before them, filled with trials still to come. But in that vastness she no longer saw emptiness. She saw promise. And with her daughters nestled close and the rancher standing firm at her side, she stepped forward into it, unafraid. The echoes of hooves would always haunt her memory, but they no longer owned her. What owned her now was life, fierce and unyielding, carved from hardship yet softened by hope. And as the wind whispered across the plains, carrying away the last shadows of the past, she knew in her heart they had already won.